This one sentence really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. It's not a story about faith ending. It's about how the complete and utter destruction of a sacred place actually forced a people to reinvent themselves. They had to create a whole new identity, something so tough it would last for thousands of years. It's this incredible story of how a nation, right when it lost absolutely everything, found a new beginning in the one thing no one could destroy: their words.
All right, so let's set the scene. We're starting at the absolute peak of the ancient Israelite kingdom, right under the famous King Solomon. And for a little while, it was a true golden age. I mean, this kingdom was huge, stretching from the southern deserts all the way up to the cedar forests of Lebanon. And smack dab in the middle of it all, at its very heart, was one single incredible building.
But you've got to understand, the temple wasn't just some building. No way. It was everything. Think of it like this. It was the physical proof of God's promise to his people. It was the symbol that held the nation together, and it was the ultimate stamp of approval for the king's power. It was built with this beautiful, fragrant cedar and just covered in pure gold. The whole idea was that this was the one spot on earth where heaven and earth could actually meet.
But all that glory? It came with a pretty steep price. I mean, building an empire like that is ridiculously expensive. So Solomon slapped massive taxes on everyone, and this is the big one. He started a system of forced labor. And the northern tribes, they really felt like they were getting the short end of the stick, shouldering most of the work. And if that wasn't enough, Solomon's political marriages brought in hundreds of foreign princesses. And guess what? They brought their gods with them. Suddenly, you've got altars to all these other deities popping up on the hills around Jerusalem. You can just see the cracks starting to form in the kingdom's foundation.
So when Solomon dies, those cracks don't just crack, they shatter the whole thing. His son, Rehoboam, takes over, and the northern tribes go to him and say, "Hey, can you maybe ease up a bit?" His response was, well, it was not great. He basically said, "You think my dad was tough? I'm going to be way worse." And that was it. That was the last straw. The 10 northern tribes just walked. They broke away and formed their own kingdom of Israel. That left the 2 tribes in the south as the kingdom of Judah. And for the next couple hundred years, you have these 2 brother kingdoms living side by side as bitter rivals.
And that big split, way back around 930 BCE, that was really just the beginning of a long, slow-motion collapse. You see, over the next couple of centuries, this new superpower, the Assyrian Empire, starts rising, and they're putting incredible pressure on both kingdoms. First to go is the north. They fall in 722 BCE. The south manages to hang on for a little while longer, but eventually they meet their own terrible end in 586 BCE, thanks to the next big superpower on the block, Babylon.
Okay, so this is where the story takes a really dark turn. We're moving from internal fighting to just total annihilation from the outside. All the warnings from the prophets were ignored, and these massive empires were on the move. For the people living in Israel and Judah, it must have felt like their entire world was about to come crashing down.
So, first up, the northern kingdom. Now the Assyrians, they weren't your average conquerors. They were masters of psychological warfare. Their whole strategy was brutal, but man, was it effective. They would conquer a place, and then they'd deport the entire leadership, the skilled workers, the educated class, everyone, and just scatter them all across their empire. Then they'd bring in other conquered people to fill the empty land. It was a way to completely erase a nation's identity. And that's exactly what happened to the 10 tribes of Israel. They were scattered, they blended in with other cultures, and they basically vanished from history, becoming what we now call the lost tribes.
So for more than 100 years, the southern kingdom of Judah actually manages to hang on. But they just couldn't outlast the next big empire that came along, the Babylonians. After a rebellion that went horribly wrong, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar shows up with his entire army right at the gates of Jerusalem. And in this one single terrible year, the fate of the nation was sealed.
Just imagine, the siege went on for almost 2 years. 2 years of starvation, of disease, of desperation. When the city walls were finally broken, the Babylonian army poured in, and they showed zero mercy. They stole everything of value, they burned the city, and then they went for the heart. They burned Solomon's incredible temple, the very house of God, right down to the ground.
And just like the Assyrians did up north, the Babylonians followed the same playbook. They rounded up all of Judah's best and brightest. We're talking the royal family, the priests from the temple, the scribes, the artisans, basically anyone who knew how to make the country run. They were all put in chains and forced to march hundreds of miles into exile in Babylon. It's like the nation was literally decapitated.
And for the people who survived this, they were left with this just impossible, soul-crushing question. If the temple was God's actual home on earth, and it's now just a pile of smoking rubble, what does that even mean? Does it mean God was defeated? Did he just abandon them? I mean, how can you survive as a people when the two things that define you, your land and your temple, are just gone?
Well, the answer, amazingly, didn't come from a king or a high priest. It came from the survivors themselves, right there in the heart of the very empire that destroyed them. This experience of exile, it wasn't going to be the end of their story. It was actually the beginning of something brand new and totally radical.
Yeah, this line from the Psalms, it just perfectly captures that feeling of heartbreak and being completely lost. Think about it. You're in a strange land, surrounded by a culture you don't understand, people worshiping gods you've never heard of. Of course, their first reaction was just this deep, overwhelming sadness for everything they'd lost. Their home, their independence, and their temple, what they called Zion.
But here's the thing. Life in Babylon was a bit more complicated than you might imagine. Now, they weren't free, but most of them weren't slaves in the way we usually think of it. They were allowed to live in their own communities, they could farm, they had jobs, some even became merchants. The one big rule was, you can't go home. So, what do? Well, they started gathering together, in small groups, in their own homes. They did the only thing they really could do. They remembered. They started telling their kids the old stories, reciting the laws, keeping the memory alive.
And right here, this is the moment where everything changes. This is the big pivot. With no temple to go to for sacrifices, they had to figure something else out. And they came to this absolutely revolutionary idea. What if God isn't just stuck in one building? What if his presence is actually in the words, in the sacred texts? And just like that, their faith starts to shift. It goes from being about a physical place to being about a text. They couldn't go to the temple anymore, but they could carry the Torah, the law, with them, right in their heads and in their hearts.
And a shift that big, it completely turned their whole social structure upside down. You see, before, the most powerful people were the priests. Their authority was all tied to the temple, to the sacrifices. But no temple, no power. Their whole job just vanished. So a new kind of leader steps up, the scribe, the scholar. His power didn't come from his family tree, it came from what he knew. Suddenly, the most important person in the community wasn't the guy with the right bloodline, but the one who could read, understand, and teach the sacred text to everyone else.
Okay, so fast forward about 70 years, and the whole political map of the world shifts again. The exiles get this incredible chance to actually go home. But here's the key. They weren't just going back to rebuild a temple. They were going to build a totally new kind of society, one that was based on this new identity they had hammered out in the fires of exile.
I mean, it's just a wild turn of events. The Babylonian Empire, which seemed invincible, gets conquered by the Persians. And the new Persian king, Cyrus the Great, he had a completely different philosophy. Instead of deporting people to control them, he thought it was smarter to let them go home and worship their own gods. He figured happy subjects are stable subjects. So he issues this famous decree telling the Judean exiles, you can go home, go back to Jerusalem, rebuild your temple.
But, and this is so important, they didn't just hit rewind and recreate the past. What they built was totally different. Instead of that magnificent first temple of Solomon's, they put up a much smaller, more modest second temple. Instead of being a powerful, independent kingdom, now they're just a small province in the huge Persian Empire. They had literally transformed from a nation of subjects who followed a king into a community of believers, held together by their shared faith.
This created a whole new kind of public life, something nobody had ever seen before. You have leaders like the scribe Ezra gathering everyone together in the town square, not for a coronation, but to read the book of the law out loud for hours. And from that moment on, being part of the community had nothing to do with what side of a border you lived on or which king you served. It was all about your shared dedication to this text. This is when they truly become the people of the book.
So why is this such a huge deal? Well, because this new identity, it was portable. Think about it. A king can be killed. A temple can be torn down. A border can be redrawn. But a book, an idea, a collection of stories and laws that people carry around in their heads, that can go anywhere. That can survive anything. This incredible transformation that happened in Babylon built the foundation for an identity that would last for the next 2,500 years, allowing the Jewish people to survive even when they were scattered all over the world in the diaspora.
And that really brings us to the final big question, doesn't it? When you look at the entire story of ancient Israel and Judah, you realize something profound. A fortress made of stone, no matter how grand, is ultimately breakable. But a story that people remember and share, once that takes root in a community, it becomes the strongest, most indestructible fortress you could ever build.